Hi everyone, my name is Eliana Osborne, and I guess I get to be the first one to do a presentation. I hope this is what our professor is looking for and that you all learned something new today. We covered 2 chapters this week for Module 3. Both of them were pretty heavy, but I have confidence that we can handle all this talk about rational and non rational ways to look at policy. I think group theory and elite theory are very similar because they both point to small segments of society having outside influence on policy decisions. A group that is effective has access and money, just like with elites. The other non rational model is incrementalism, which we have probably all seen in our communities. It takes a long time for something to be fully funded or defunded, as budget changes are done in small amounts at a time. The textbook gives financial examples under 10% as being likely to not ruffle any feathers. The fourth part of this section is an axiom rather than a model. This is the idea of unintended consequences. You can be as well researched and thought out as possible, but any policy will have unexpected results. These can be good or bad. There's an example of TV ratings making it easier to choose adult content instead of this keeping young people away from it as intended. I think of school attendance policies that went away during the COVID-19 pandemic so that kids wouldn't come to school sick. That may have helped, but an unintended consequence is that families have a much more lenient view of attendance now for vacation or breaks as well as medical issues. Policies are going to have to be remade, but I don't know of anywhere that has figured that out precisely quite yet. There's a huge amount of information to cover about the critiques of the rational model. The textbook breaks it down into 4 areas, most of which are actually 2 things each. First up is the intellectual or analytical critique. These talk about how the rational model is unrealistic because we are humans with limits. This is called the human problem. We are not as rational as we would like to believe, and we need models or metaphors to understand the world. These tools are necessarily limited. Even those of us who love data and analytics cannot get enough to make truly rational analyses. The analytical problem ties into this because problems are endlessly complex. We can't compute every possibility. We also have a tendency to look at the short term more than the long term. Cognitive critiques can be summed up with a quote from Clemens, and Macbeth. Our brain is a meaning-making machine that wants to be right rather than a seeker of unvarnished truth. There's some fascinating information about how heredity might play a role in our political leanings, which I never would have expected. I would have thought nurture or environment would explain all of that. A key element of the cognitive is that whatever our political leanings, there are narratives that are more sticky to our brains. All our baggage and experience can make us ignore evidence that doesn't align with our previous beliefs. Excuse me. This is a really tricky issue, especially as we grow more divided as a country. The next critique is the political and institutional. A reminder of what we mean by politics, according to the authors. Politics is choices being made in a conflict-filled environment involving various levels of power, often including the government. In the United States, we usually require consensus building to create a majority to adopt a policy. That also ties into the concepts of incrementalism, because all these groups coming together want different things, so major changes aren't really an option. We also have to remember that non-decisions are decisions. When something doesn't progress in the process, that's a signal that it doesn't have the support necessary for policy. In talking about organizations or institutions, things can get super non-rational. The authors write, well, in one very real sense, individuals decide. In another equally real sense, organizations or subunits within organizations decide. This ties in with the group theory, of course. There's also role theory and Miles's law, which I really like. Where you stand depends on where you sit. Finally, we get to the fourth critique, the ideological and philosophical. We've talked a lot about data in this class already, but this reiterates that analysts are fallible and have biases, so it matters who is in the room when decisions are being made. I would like to insert a song from Hamilton here, but I'll refrain. You can listen to The Room Where It Happens on your own time. There's a great quote from Deborah Stone in the textbook that sums this up nicely. She says, "We are as much influenced by the source of information, the person's race, looks, social manners, reputation, and credentials, or whether the source is a person or some other medium, as by the content itself." While I know this is true and human nature, it still makes me cringe. This also ties into the concept of NIMBY, or not in my backyard. I have strong feelings about this as it really brings out the ugliest side of a community. In terms of the philosophical critique, we are looking at the impacts of subjectivity. Everything we've talked about earlier on this slide ties in here. Our values are so entrenched that they can make us consider if there is even a problem and if it should even be addressed. Now we'll dive into chapter 5. We'll talk about theories of policy process, including streams and other process models, as well as agenda setting and all the way to funding and evaluation. First up is John King Dunn's multiple streams theory or framework. This is easy to visualize with 3 different streams going along in life: the problem stream, the politics stream, and the policy stream. For those streams to move the policy process forward, they must come together in a window of opportunity. Otherwise, none of these streams on their own is enough to get an issue the attention needed. In the ACF, or Advocacy Coalition Framework, you have groups or coalitions with policy beliefs. They use their resources and strategies to influence policy. But then when one gets more power and we have a change in control, that's when policy change happens. Another theory is punctuated equilibrium, or PE. This says that public policy is characterized by long periods of political stability punctuated by rapid periods of dramatic policy change. This can happen when groups change the policy image of an issue, like with tobacco. As an agriculture issue, things were pretty mellow. But when the conversation changed to health, that's when dramatic change in policy occurred. Finally is the narrative policy framework. This emphasizes the ideological critique of rationalism that we talked about. We present information to make groups and people see that there is a problem to be solved and that it needs to be solved. The image or story of a policy is hugely important when we get into the window of opportunity to get something onto the agenda. The textbook example of Malala putting a face on an issue is a powerful one, and I assume most of you are familiar with her story. Of Malala putting a face on an issue is a powerful one, and I assume most of you are familiar with her story. The authors state, public policies result after there is a subjective determination that an issue is a public problem. It isn't just that something isn't right. It has to be identified as a problem that is a public issue. This is part of the frustration of policy work, I think, because we can be aware of issues that we aren't able to get on an agenda. One example I can think of from my own experience is special education. It took a very long time, decades, to get national attention for equality in education for all students. We continue to have issues on this subject that only get attention when something dramatic happens, locally or nationally. But those working on special education know any number of issues with policy and application. Even the terminology we use, special education or exceptional student services, has had to be carefully messaged. ESS, or exceptional student services, has been a coalition building word as it refers to students who are gifted as well as those with severe disabilities. All of this group of students need additional services. On page 151 of the textbook, figure 5.2 has a great diagram about agenda setting, which has 3 stages. In stage one, someone tries to create an issue. This is really helped by something to catalyze conversation, a tragedy, a popular book, a national figure being involved. If people or groups are ready to seize this window of opportunity, we can create an issue. Stage two is about deciding on details of the issue. What is the specific issue? Too big and it's unwieldy. Too narrow and it will be hard to get a coalition of groups to care about it. This is a lot of the unsexy behind the scenes work. Once the issue is tightened up, then groups try to get it out there to the bigger community. Media is a huge part of that. It takes a lot of repeat exposure for someone to start noticing that an issue is being talked about in the broader world. When this is successful, people in power might become interested. This works best if the policy primeval soup already has a simmering fix to this problem that has already been talked about. Stage three discusses the difference between the systemic agenda and the institutional agenda. Even if the public is caring about an issue, that doesn't mean government will. Remember that inaction is a valid policy decision choice. Policies are generally formed incrementally as different groups weigh in and modify how a policy will actually look. The text reminds us that there is not enough money to go around, and there will always be conflict over valid but competing projects. This next step is actual implementation. I'm currently taking an elections class, and a huge part of that process is policy implementation. There are laws, but most election management happens on a local level, so there's a lot that is left up to individual decisions. In Arizona, the Secretary of State's office puts together a whole election manual with input from the state election board and the governor. Right now, there is a lawsuit going on because of some partisan differences about the Secretary's interpretation of the law. Implementation is probably something we'll talk about more in the future because it's an ongoing issue. Some officials simply won't implement policies that they don't like. Finally, just when you think you might be done, we get to policy evaluation, adjustment, and termination. We talked earlier about the unexpected consequences of policies, which are inevitable. But you also have to take a look at how things are going. This can be formal or informal, and adjustments should be assumed. I hope you feel more confident about all the material covered in Public Policy Praxis chapters 4 and 5.